p.m. on GB News.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton Tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Lawrence Fox, on GB News. Frank, fun, fearless, and sometimes serious. Much as I love a Friday night punch-up, what I really want is a battle of ideas. I want to look at things differently. I want to hear different voices and engage with your unique experiences. Every Friday at 7 p.m. on GB News.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Good evening, I'm Ray Addison in the GB Newsroom. Police say a young woman killed in a Merseyside pub shooting is not believed to have been the gunman's target. 26-year-old Elle Edwards was at the Lighthouse pub in Wallasey Village on Christmas Eve when the incident took place. 4 men were also treated for gunshot wounds. The search for the gunman is still ongoing. A 10th person has died as a result of an explosion at a block of flats in Jersey earlier this month. 73-year-old Kathy McGuinness died in hospital on Christmas Day. The blast, which happened in the early hours on the 10th of December, destroyed a building in St Helier. An inquest will open this Friday before being adjourned while the investigation continues. At least 55 people are believed to have died as a result of a severe Arctic freeze that continues to grip much of the US and Canada. Officials say 25 people have been killed in Buffalo, in New York State, where temperatures dropped as low as -9. Across the US and Canada, thousands of flights have been cancelled and more than 150,000 homes are still without power. The UK's rail networks have been at a standstill today as members of the RMT union hold strike action over pay. Hundreds of trains usually run on Boxing Day, but they've all been cancelled. 20,000 Eurostar passengers were also forced to make alternative plans as it cancelled services to London, Paris, Brussels and Amsterdam. And Boxing Day shoppers may have defied expectations, with early data suggesting that footfall has actually risen. Industry analyst Springboard say it may have increased by as much as half when compared to this time last year. It follows concerns that the cost of living crisis, coupled with rail strikes, may have kept some people at home. Earlier, Barclaycard said the average customer intended to spend 4% less than in 2021. We're on TV, online and DAB Plus radio. You're watching GB News. I'll be back with more at the top of the hour.
Hello and welcome to the year in politics. And what a year it's been. 3 prime ministers, 4 chancellors and 1 new king. A cost of living crisis, a war in Europe and a peculiar week when Westminster fixated itself upon the longevity of a lettuce. Yes, 2022 has been the most unpredictable, most wild year in Westminster since, well, the last one. Let's kick it all off by looking back over the first 3 months of the year. January kicked off with a cloud over Boris Johnson after a Christmas of alleged revelations about lockdown parties. For a brief while, an unknown civil servant, Sue Gray, seemed to be the most powerful woman in the country as she prepared her report into Downing Street misbehaviour. But when it came, it was a bit of a damp squib.
That is because, Mr. Speaker, the report does absolutely nothing to substantiate the tissue of nonsense he has just spoken.
However, Boris Johnson wasted no time creating a new crisis for himself with a swipe at Sir Keir Starmer over the Jimmy Savile scandal.
He spent most of his time prosecuting journalists and failing to prosecute Jimmy Savile, as far as I can make out, Mr. Speaker.
Well, several of the Prime Minister's top aides resigned, one of his closest saying that there was no fair or reasonable basis for this claim. But the Jimmy Savile row was rather thrown into perspective by Vladimir Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine in late February. Westminster was collectively aghast at reports of atrocities from the front line. Despite defiant words from the Ukrainians, it seemed that Kiev would fall in a matter of days.
There are some terrible atrocities being committed, and there will be some very grim days ahead for Ukraine.
The war, of course, worsened the cost of living crisis at home. And in March, Chancellor Rishi Sunak made his spring statement, raising national insurance, although cutting fuel duty.
So when I talk about security, yes, I mean responding to the war in Ukraine. But I also mean the security of a faster growing economy, the security of more resilient public finances, and security for working families as we help with the cost of living.
Well, let's dive right in and explore what went on firstly in those first 3 months of the year. I'm joined by Olivia Utley, political reporter at GB News, and Rachel Cunliffe is senior associate editor at The New Statesman. First of all, it seems like for about half of my life now we've been talking about who was at what party, when and where. This was all already going by the start of the year, Olivia.
Yeah, so the Christmas parties were a bit of a story at the end of 2021, and then everything went a bit quiet over the new year. And all the scandals, so to speak, really started to break in January. It was all about which of those parties Boris Johnson had attended, which aides were there, whose fault it was that the parties started at all. And this went on, as far as I can remember, for weeks and weeks and weeks. And every day another journalist was coming up with a huge breaking story about a specific party on a specific night. And it really mattered which party was which. I mean, it doesn't sound like it anymore, but the rules during lockdown were so specific that and whether it was a law that was broken or just a rule or just guidance was all very important. So it all mattered a lot which parties were which and who was there and why they were there, because some of them they could just about swing it as a work event. And that, as far as I remember, took up a large part of January and some of February.
And it was the drip, drip, drip of these stories that really made it such a big media story. I suppose if it all had come out on one day, one thing at the start, it wouldn't have blown up into this huge thing that it became.
No, I think you're right. I think if Downing Street had come out and said, here's a list of all the gatherings, we thought they were justified for work at the time, we could see that maybe they possibly crossed into things that you weren't allowed to do in the guidance. We're very sorry about that. It was a very confusing time. end of story, that might have been the end of it. I think why it lasted so long was this drip, drip, drip. It was the flat-out denials from Downing Street, particularly from Boris Johnson himself, who sort of said categorically several times, no parties happened, the rules were followed at all times, and that very clear denial meant that there was sort of an incentive for journalists to go and find out exactly what had been happening, and then we just got an endless list. I can't remember how many there were in total. I think it was over 20, and some of them were full-blown parties with karaoke machines and things that actually sound quite fun. Some of them are things that I don't think you or I would have really thought were a party at the time. It was sort of some colleagues having some food or some drinks after work.
And I suppose it was also muddled up there, because the things that sounded most like they were parties, the sick on the walls, the broken swing, the karaoke machine, they happened when the Prime Minister wasn't at Downing Street.
Yes, and that was a big part of it too. And the Prime Minister could also make the argument that it was his home. And the other thing which I found really strange about the whole thing was, as you say, the ones which sounded the most like parties seemed to be the ones which they sort of got away with, whereas the one which seemed to come out as the worst was the one where Boris Johnson walked into a room and someone ambushed him with cane. And Rishi Sunak, as far as it appeared, had turned up 5 minutes early for a meeting. And Rishi Sunak, I think we can all agree, isn't a big party
He's not
animal.
a party type.
And had turned up a bit early for a meeting and was suddenly drawn into the whole thing as well.
Well, we'll get on to that bit a bit later, because of course Sue Gray couldn't report her final report in January as was expected, because the Met Police got involved. And once that Metropolitan Police investigation was underway, Sue Gray said, well, I can't publish any of my findings for quite some more time. But that wasn't, of course, the only thing that happened in the first 3 months of this year. There was a bit of a big clash in the midst of all of this wrangling over Partygate between the Prime Minister and Sir Keir Starmer. At one Prime Minister's questions, the Prime Minister used a phrase that many people found distasteful about Jimmy Savile.
So the insinuation at Prime Minister's questions was that Keir Starmer, when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, was personally responsible for not prosecuting Jimmy Savile, the child sex offender. And the reason that I think this exploded in the way it did is, well, one, it's false, it's inaccurate, and he wasn't involved in that decision. But two, it's a line that kind of comes from a conspiracy theory that is associated with the alt-right, associated with a lot of sort of very unsavoury characters. And so to have the Prime Minister bring that up in Parliament was kind of a big deal. Now, whether or not he meant it to be that, I don't think is necessarily the issue. He didn't apologise for it, and the kind of key takeaway from that moment was the resignation of his key aide, Munira Mirza, who'd worked with him for 15 years when he was Mayor of London, brought into Downing Street, who had been very, very supportive of him through all of the scandals that we could go into to do with Boris Johnson. And that was the moment when she quit, and that's why I think it was kind of a turning point in the Boris Johnson.
Perhaps a sign of things to come, but I suppose there is the argument that if you're at the top of an organisation, you take responsibility for what people, even if you're not personally involved with the decision, you take responsibility. And there's a funny sort of parallel there between what Boris Johnson was accused of in terms of not personally attending some of these crazy parties, but being at the head of the organisation and somehow being responsible. I suppose he was trying to draw a bit of a comparison there.
That definitely was the comparison he was trying to draw, but it did come off quite strangely, and people, thought that it was sort of playing into this very online conspiracy theory about Jimmy Savile and Keir Starmer. There was one argument that was made at the time that Boris Johnson wasn't exactly in charge of Downing Street. Boris Johnson was in charge of the country, and it was civil servants who were in charge of making Downing Street run. So one argument that I remember Charles Moore and other Boris Johnson allies putting forward was that actually Boris Johnson was sitting there in charge of running the country. How Downing Street is run isn't really his job. If he was told to turn up and shake hands with people to thank them for all their hard work over this very difficult period, then he was sort of obliged to do that. And if it got out of control, it wasn't really his fault. That was sort of the only big defence of Boris Johnson I heard in that period. And as Rachel says, I think that when Munira Mirza resigned with a very cutting resignation letter talking about Boris Johnson's competency, that was, in hindsight, probably the beginning of the end.
And yet, a big lifeline for Boris Johnson. A confusing and odd lifeline, because people stopped talking about cakes and parties on the 24th of February when Russia invaded Ukraine.
I think it was a lifeline for him, because I think if you look at the trajectory of the way the scandals were ramping up, then suddenly this massive geopolitical event happens and puts it all into perspective, and it all looks rather trivial, which indeed it should. And I think that if you're reflecting on Boris Johnson's legacy as Prime Minister, one of the things that we can probably all agree he should take great pride in is the strength of Britain's reaction to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the way he said right from the beginning that we were going to support Ukraine with military support, with financial support, and also by just rhetorically making it very clear that this was an illegal war, and that other European leaders who were perhaps trying to soften their stance to Putin a little bit worried about how should the EU react, how should they react. It was a very strong position from Britain, and that, I think, was led by Boris Johnson.
Coming up after the break, trouble for Boris Johnson over local and by-elections, and a peculiar scandal in Westminster over tractor pornography.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. B, I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone, and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Welcome back to the year in politics. We're looking at some of the biggest political moments of the year. Coming up, some ballot box trouble for Boris Johnson and, for good measure, tractor pornography.
Spring blossomed into an old-fashioned Westminster sex scandal, this time over claims that a Member of Parliament watched pornography in the House of Commons. It turned out to be Neil Parish, who only days before had played the issue down on GB News.
I think if you've got sort of 650 members of parliament in what is, a very sort of very intense area, I mean, you are going to get people that step over the line. I mean, is it, I don't think there's necessarily a huge culture here.
Yet more questions about the culture in Westminster. It all ended with Parish's resignation. Meanwhile, Partygate was not going away for the Prime Minister. He and his Chancellor became the first holders of those offices to receive a fixed penalty notice from the police for breaking the law.
I understand the anger that many will feel that I myself fell short when it came to observing the very rules which the government I lead had introduced to protect the public. And I accept in all sincerity that people had the right to expect better.
And to the delight of Westminster journalists, Sue Gray finally released the pictures she'd obtained of alleged lockdown parties inside Downing Street. A few days beforehand, local elections across much of the UK, and a disaster for Boris Johnson and the Conservatives. Tory strongholds like Wandsworth and Westminster turned red at the hands of angry voters.
It's been a terrible night for the Conservatives in London, and to lose Wandsworth, which was very much the crown jewel for the Conservatives in London. I mean, they've held the seat for over 40 years.
A crisis in Northern Ireland too, as Republicans' Sinn Féin became the largest party. Power sharing was once again up in the air, just as the Foreign Secretary announced plans to junk parts of the Brexit deal on Northern Ireland.
We will take the necessary decisions to preserve peace and stability.
June rolled around, and perhaps Boris Johnson's worst month yet. He survived a vote of no confidence by his own MPs.
I can announce that the Parliamentary Party does have confidence.
But presided over some disastrous by-elections, losing the key red wall seat of Wakefield, and even a blue wall Tory stronghold, Tiverton and Honiton, to the Lib Dems. And with impeccable timing, yet another sex scandal unfolded, as the Deputy Chief Whip was accused of groping men. Boris Johnson initially claimed he didn't know of Chris Pincher's reputation. He was forced later to backtrack. Despite the turmoil in Westminster, Britain celebrated Her Majesty's Platinum Jubilee. But there was also a sad portent of things to come, as for the first time, Prince Charles stood in for the Queen at the state opening of Parliament.
Well, the turbulent times, of course, did not abate, and April brought with it a great array of stories over Pestminster. And this was a phrase that began in sort of 2017, but had a big flare-up in 2022. What was going on?
Well, I think it all began with Neil Parish, who... quite a sort of funny story by the comparisons of the rest of the year. He was watching porn in Parliament, and it came out, he lied about it at first. He claimed that what he was doing was looking up a particular kind of tractor called a Dominator, and accidentally found himself on a different sort of website. He then looked at it again, where he couldn't really claim that he was still just trying to look at tractors, and a couple of female Conservative MPs saw and obviously reported him because this was inappropriate, and in the end it took a while, but he had to resign the whip. The fact that it took a while sort of underlined ideas that were already blossoming in Parliament, that Boris Johnson was sort of losing control a bit of his party, and there was a sort of theory that because Boris Johnson's own personal life was a bit chaotic, it was quite difficult for him to discipline his MPs, and that problem carried on over the next couple of months.
I just say that I did Google the Dominator tractor and I didn't find any porn, so I'm not quite sure how Neil Parish got there.
I wonder what algorithms are at play in people's phones, but it wasn't the only story, of course, there. To some extent, there there are more troubling stories of various MPs under investigation as well in this period.
Yeah, there were a number of MPs that fell under the sort of Pestminster umbrella, as well as Neil Parish. There was Imran Khan, who was convicted of child sexual assault, which triggered another by-election. And these two by-elections, the one in Tiverton and Honiton, the Conservatives had a majority of 24,000, very, very safe Conservative seat. Wakefield, which was Imran Khan's constituency, was a red wall seat where it was predicted that Labour would probably take that. So the Conservatives found themselves fighting on two very different fronts, under fire from two very different sections of the electorate. And as it became apparent that those elections wouldn't go well, which indeed they very much did not for the Conservatives, the idea that Boris Johnson, for all of his flaws, was somebody who could unite the country and get people voting Conservative who perhaps might never have done so, and had this widespread appeal that was very beneficial to the Tories, even if he had all of his issues. That started to fade away because it became obvious that actually voters were deserting the party, and if Boris wasn't able to bring all those different coalitions together, what was the point of him?
And in the midst of all of this, of course, we got the final fines. The Metropolitan Police issued 2 fines, one for Boris Johnson, one for Rishi Sunak, and there were over 100 for the various civil servants and special advisors who operated within Number 10 as well. What did that mean for the party?
It was pretty damning for the party. There were those who sort of argued that getting a fine for breaking these lockdown rules was sort of the same as getting a speeding ticket, and you wouldn't expect the Prime Minister to resign because he had a speeding ticket. But obviously, because the Prime Minister had put these very stringent lockdown rules in place, and there were lots of people who missed out on huge family events and funerals and seeing their mothers on their deathbeds, there was a lot of anger in the country at large that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor had both been fined for breaking these rules.
And yet it was interesting because the Chancellor wasn't really considered to have done anything particularly wrong. Rishi Sunak turned up a little bit early for a meeting where there happened to be a cake on the table. I don't think anyone ate the cake. I mean, we really are getting into the most trivial sort of situations here, and yet because the Chancellor got a fine, some people started to think, well, maybe there was a bit of a video that had appeared about the leader of the Labour Party drinking beer at a similar time of restrictions when indoor socialising was against the rules, outdoor socialising was illegal, comparable time to this Boris Johnson birthday story. And something called Beergate began.
This is where I think it all started to get a bit silly. And I say this as somebody who doesn't think that it was right for Rishi Sunak to get that fine for what was clearly an accident. But this was a work meeting, event up in Durham, and Keir Starmer is there drinking a beer and there was some pizza. Durham obviously is also the place where Dominic Cummings was not fined for his lockdown breaking trip up there and then subsequent trip to test his eyesight in Barnard Castle. But there were, I think, justifiable questions about, hang on, the Labour side were doing it too. And obviously Labour had been calling for harsh restrictions, even if they weren't actually involved in making them.
And towards the end of this period, we got Boris Johnson's first visit to Ukraine, to Kyiv, where really, whenever there was a bit of domestic trouble, we did see the Prime Minister get on the phone to his good friend Vladimir. That relationship was real, though. That friendship between Boris Johnson and Vladimir Zelensky was strong.
Absolutely, and I think, yeah, we were all quite cynical about it at the time because it did feel as though whenever there was a drama breaking off, Boris went to Kyiv. But Boris Johnson was, as Rach was saying earlier, sort of at the very top of the pack, really. He was leading the pack on helping Ukraine, and Volodymyr Zelensky really did get on with him very well. And we saw this quite bizarre thing where, as Boris Johnson's popularity was fast waning in the UK, it was massively on the rise in Kyiv. And there was a period when there was a particular type of croissant that was like in the shape of Boris Johnson's face being sold on the streets of Ukraine. So it was a very strange disparity going on there.
I think you're probably going to get some Ukrainian boys named Boris if you the next couple of years. It's going to be a very popular name, but it did certainly feel that every time he was in trouble for anything, off he went or picked up the phone, and you did wonder if maybe Zelensky might have had other things on his plate rather than dealing with the waning popularity of Boris Johnson.
Coming up, A hot summer in Westminster as the temperature rises amongst MPs. Boris Johnson is booted out and a leadership election gets underway.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
The guy went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions. I have no time for cultural totalitarianism. We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me! And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to a year in politics. Boris Johnson's luck ran out in July, and after that, for a while, Liz Truss appeared unassailable. Well, a week is a long time in politics.
July began with Westminster in a fervour, with the Prime Minister forced to admit that he knew of sex allegations against one of his whips. His Health Secretary resigned in disgust.
We have to conclude that enough is enough.
Followed 5 minutes later by his Chancellor.
Are you going to be the next Prime Minister?
Boris Johnson's government was in its final crisis. It prompted a veritable avalanche of ministerial resignations. After 2 days of intense pressure and speculation, the Prime Minister threw in the towel.
I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks.
But the brakes were off in the race for number 10. A host of Conservative MPs threw in their hats, including the largely unknown Raymond Chishti, who seemed to be the only person to fancy himself for the job. For a brief moment, it seemed like the smart money could be behind Penny Mordaunt to be the next Prime Minister. But ultimately, Rishi Sunak was the favourite of Tory MPs. They placed him forward to the membership, along with the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss. The campaign stretched on for nearly 2 months, the candidates touring the country, speaking to members. But it seemed that the party couldn't forgive the former Chancellor for appearing to stab Boris Johnson in the back. And Liz Truss, with her campaign focusing on tax cuts, was triumphant.
Therefore, I give notice that Liz Truss is elected as the leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party.
The next day, she flew to Balmoral to meet Her Majesty the Queen. A smiling monarch greeting her 15th and final Prime Minister. The last time we would ever see her.
Well, if looking back, the start of the year was the beginning of the end for Boris Johnson, July was the end of the end for Boris Johnson. And Olivia, those final 2 weeks of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, before he announced his resignation, what went wrong?
Well, it was pretty extraordinary, really. We had the resignation of Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak, 2 big beasts in the Conservative Party, the Chancellor and the Health Secretary. And that, everyone assumed, was going to be the end, and that a couple of hours later you would see the resignation of the Prime Minister. That's not what happened. Over the next 48 hours, we saw a slew of resignations like has never happened before in British politics. There was just minister after minister going down to the really, really junior ranks, sending in these really cutting letters of resignation, posting them all over Twitter. Everyone was talking about it. There were departments, the Education Department at one point had only 1 minister out of 8, and that was some sort of very, very junior person in the Lords. So it felt as though, what is going to happen? Can he possibly carry on hanging on? People at one point were sort of comparing him to Donald Trump, refusing to leave after the election. And this went on for an extraordinary period of time, really, although looking back, it was only sort of 2 days.
It was pure chaos, though. It was absolute pure chaos. He was losing ministers faster than he could replace them. He went into a select committee meeting the day after Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak resigned and acted as if nothing was wrong when every single member of that select committee was really laying into him. And I think during that meeting, 4, possibly 5 ministers resigned as it was going on. So it really was extraordinary. And I think there was a sense in sort of the core Team Boris camp that he could tough it out, because he toughed out every other scandal that would have taken down any other Prime Minister. And I think he thought that this was just like all the others. It was only when it really got to the point where there weren't enough people to fill his government that he finally announced that he would be standing down.
When even the people he reappointed to fill the gaps started resigning as well.
Yes, we had an education secretary who lasted 36 hours because she took the job and then went, no, thank you. She didn't take her pay out for that, by the way, and I think
that's admirable.
That is worth
but
pointing out.
It is interesting, though, because he did survive a confidence vote of the parliamentary party a mere few weeks beforehand. There was all of this discussion at that time that the 1922 committee executive were going to change the rules and that another vote would be held. Is there not an argument that that might have been a more legitimate thing, a proper process whereby MPs actually voted him out rather than just forcing him out with their resignations?
Yeah, it was a bit odd, really, because people didn't... everyone was turning against Boris Johnson when there was this vote of no confidence, but there was a sort of worry that they didn't really know who was going to replace him. So the only power that they had was just resigning in their droves, but it still left the problem of there's no one really to fill the gap.
But after all, Boris Johnson did decide to resign, but a leadership election started. And at the start, there were a huge number of candidates. What was going on?
I think what was going on is there wasn't a clear successor to Boris Johnson. If there had been a clear successor, then I think that vote of no confidence the first time round would have gone a very different way. Usually what happens is Tory MPs line up who they want, and it's a very sort of slick and ruthless mechanism rather than the chaos that we saw. And given that there wasn't a clear successor, everyone threw their hat in the ring, which I actually think was quite a good thing. You got to have representation from different wings of the party. They got to have a conversation about what what they actually wanted the Conservative Party to be. Interestingly, none of those candidates, I think, were particularly warm about Boris Johnson, even though all of them had obviously benefited from him being in power. So there was this real tension between trying to channel the support and the popularity that Boris Johnson had had, while also making it clear that they were very different. Some of them, I think, were more successful than others.
And who could forget the 1 or 2 day candidacy of Raymond Chistry, someone who nominated himself?
Yes, and I think he only managed to get his own backing, and you needed a few more than that to manage to get on the ballot paper. Yeah, it was this hugely wide open campaign. Subsequently, when we had the next leadership election, not very much later, the 1922 committee changed the rules. But as it was, you only needed something like 15% of the party to support you to get through to the next stage. So yeah, in some ways it was really good because we saw this debate about what the Conservative Party was. But I think it sort of opened up all these chinks which were already there in the Conservative Party armour, and you saw these tribal factions developing. And at some points it seemed as though people had almost nothing in common. Some of the two different sides of the party. You had sort of Tom Tugendhat and Liz Truss actually very little in common. You have sort of Jeremy Hunt throwing his hat in the ring. Again, very different plan to the sort of thing that Liz Truss is offering. And there were all these different kinds of Conservatives.
Kemi
Badenoch as well, who was really the star of this period. Not very new, not very experienced in government, but got really far because she was offering a very different vision of conservatism.
You'd think perhaps if she'd held a proper cabinet post, she might well have won the thing. But it was remarkable seeing how quickly that broad field was whittled down, and then for how long the final two went on and on and on.
I think everyone can agree that the length of the will it be Liz Truss, will it be Rishi Sunak stage of the contest really did go on too long, not least because while all of the political drama was happening, we were facing a looming energy crisis and indeed economic crisis, and there very much was a sense that the Conservative Party was too focused on its own internal politics, not looking at the fact that energy bills were about to skyrocket, and while other European countries were trying to work out what they were going to do when those gas shortages hit, the UK was just looking at will it be Rishi or will it be Liz?
And of course, by the start of September, we got the answer that we'd known was going to be the answer for the previous month and a half. Liz Truss became Prime Minister. After the break, the rise and very rapid fall of Liz Truss as Prime Minister, a disastrous mini-budget, and yet another Prime Minister.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Mark Stein. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Here on GB News Live, we'll be keeping you in the picture, finding out what's happening across the country and finding out why it matters to you. We'll have the facts fast with our team of reporters and specialist correspondents. Wherever it's happening, we'll be there from 12 noon on TV, radio and online. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dubes & Co. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Dubes & Co.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
Why not take us home with you by visiting the GB News shop at gbnews.store. You'll find all the official merchandise, a really good present actually for yourself, your friends or your family.
We ship across the UK mainland at no extra cost. GB News, the People's Channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Welcome back. Well, who could forget Liz Truss's brief but eventful stint as Prime Minister? We're looking back at the final part of 2022.
Liz Truss started her premiership not as a politician, but as a stateswoman, announcing to the nation the news that was dreaded for so long.
And with the passing of the second Elizabethan age, we usher in a new era by saying the words, "God save the King."
Suddenly, politics was on hold, as the nation mourned the passing of our longest-serving and greatest monarch.
She served so faithfully for 70 years, and so having to stand in line in the queue for likely 14 hours, really not that much in comparison to what she did.
A parade of world leaders came to pay their respects. The new Prime Minister just one in a sea of dignitaries. And yet when politics finally returned, it was with a bang. The new Chancellor delivering a mini-budget that was anything but mini.
Today, we have cut stamp duty, we have allowed businesses to keep more of their own money to invest, to innovate and to grow. We have cut income tax and national insurance for millions of workers. We are securing our place in a fiercely competitive global economy with lower rates of corporation tax and lower rates of personal tax.
A vast array of tax cuts and billions spent on energy price fixing sent the markets into a tailspin. The Bank of England was forced to intervene to avert a calamity. Liz Truss's signature economic policy was shot to pieces. She made it through a depressing Tory conference, but sacked her own Chancellor and replaced him with the Sunak-supporting Jeremy Hunt.
We will reverse almost all the tax measures announced in the growth plan 3 weeks ago.
He reversed almost all of her economic policies and became Prime Minister in all but name. Days later, Liz Truss herself was forced from power.
I will remain as Prime Minister until a successor has been chosen. Thank you.
Serving just 44 days in office. The party grandees seem to have learnt their lesson.
Good afternoon again.
A short leadership contest followed. And Rishi Sunak, with his earlier warnings of economic turmoil somewhat vindicated, was crowned leader without a formal contest.
It was interesting though, those first few days. We had a cabinet reshuffle and then an energy announcement. It was going really, really quickly.
We had one of the largest interventions, I think, in modern history when it came to the amount of energy bill package support that was on offer. But we barely got the chance to process it because while that was actually being discussed in the Commons, the news broke that Her Majesty was very ill, and then we had 10 days of mourning where nothing really happened, where Liz Truss led the nation in the mourning, something that obviously Boris Johnson, I think, had been expecting and planning to do so. We had politics on hold But then it restarted, and it restarted really quite forcefully.
It really did, but let's just dwell on that for a second. The fact that this up to £200 billion sort of uncapped spend on fixing energy prices was announced. It got no political airtime. It didn't really sink into the British public because, of course, bigger news came along.
Yes, and literally as the announcement was being made in the Commons, and we all political journalists were sitting around thinking this was going to be a huge day in political journalism, and it turned out it was a huge day for the country because the Queen died later that evening. And then in we went into this official period of mourning, politics completely on hold, nothing happened. And then back with a bang. And I think part of the problem really with what we saw next, which was the mini budget, was that Liz Truss had promised to do so much so soon. She'd promised to hit the ground running. She did hit the ground running. Then she got stopped. And then she thought, right, I can just start up again. And the country wasn't ready for it. The markets weren't ready for it. Kwasi Kwarteng hadn't done any of the OBR stuff, which we're used to seeing chancellors do. We're used to seeing them stand up, explain what they're going to do, and explain how they've got the backing to do that, where they're finding the money to do that. And he hadn't done any of that. So pretty much no one was ready for what was an extraordinary budget. It was a big go for growth budget. The principle behind it was the old economic model is broken, nothing's working, we have to go drastic to fix things. That's what he tried, and within a couple of days, it had all begun to fall apart.
It had, interestingly, begun to fall apart during the Labour Party conference, which was taking place over that weekend. When markets reopened on the Monday, we saw a pretty significant move. Now, some people argue this was to do with the way that the United States was raising interest rates, the dollar was getting stronger against lots of currencies, but particularly there was something about Britain and the way that the markets had lost confidence in where Britain was. And what a time for the Labour Party to be meeting just as the pound was tumbling and indeed the Labour Party poll ratings were rising.
Well, all Labour really had to do was sit back and watch the Tories unravel, which is indeed what they did. I don't think I can remember anything from that particular conference. Something about green energy, possibly. But really the focus was very much on what was going on with Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. So the value of the pound dropped quite radically. The Bank of England had to step in to support pension funds because it really was looking like a full-blown financial crisis. And throughout all of this, Liz Truss basically hid, and I think that was one of the problems, was that she didn't feel the need, or she wasn't able to come out and explain why she'd made the decisions that she had and how she thought it was all going to work in the future, beyond just saying, I'm pro-growth. Well, everyone's pro-growth. You clearly have an economic system, markets, foreign investors who don't trust you, and just saying, repeating the same line over and over again, clearly wasn't going to cut it, and she didn't seem to realise this. She did this absolutely disastrous media round on local radio. I think it's possible she thought that maybe local radio stations would give her an easier time than some of the national broadcasters. She was clearly very wrong there, and it became apparent that maybe her plan had merit, maybe it didn't, but she didn't have the communication skills or the sort of intellectual ability to back it up and to explain it.
Although what we did also see was she didn't have a party united behind her. Conservative conference came next, and on the morning of that first day of Conservative conference, the Sunday morning, Michael Gove was out on the media round, of course no longer in the cabinet, and saying that Liz Truss should U-turn over things like reducing the top rate of tax to back where it was under Tony Blair, which on the first night of Conservative Party conference, she did. She performed her first U-turn.
Yeah, and it was a sort of clumsy U-turn. It felt very much as though she was bounced into it. Basically, the centrepiece of the mini-budget was lower tax rates for the very rich, those who are earning over 150,000. And she thought that she could turn Britain into this place where people wanted to invest, where rich people wanted to come, where rich people wanted to start businesses. And when she had to U-turn on that to me really did feel like it was the beginning of the end.
And of course that all led to the firing of the Chancellor. That first U-turn led to several more U-turns. The Chancellor being fired the next Friday.
The Chancellor being fired at having just flown back from the IMF in New York, having said, no, everything's staying exactly the same, and then the next day he's gone. I don't really understand the logic of that, because anyone who had been watching this closely knew that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, they were close friends, but they were also ideological allies, and this budget had been put together by both of them with very little input from the rest of the cabinet or the rest of the party. It was very much a shared project. So for Liz Truss to to sack her Chancellor and say it was all his fault just seemed rather disingenuous.
And then to ditch one of the big points that made her Prime Minister in the first place, the idea that we should keep corporation tax at 19%, not raise it as the country was likely facing recession. To give up that point of principle seemed like she'd given up her premiership. Of course, Jeremy Hunt came in as the new Chancellor, and many people were saying that really Jeremy Hunt's the new Prime Minister.
Yeah, there were all sorts of cartoons of Jeremy Hunt standing outside Number 11 doing standing by a lectern, making a speech about the way he wanted the country to go, because it really did seem at that point as though, what is the point of Liz Truss? She's ditched everything that she stood for in the leadership campaign, which she won, and you basically did just have Jeremy Hunt running the country. And then, of course, there was the next huge blow, which was the resignation of Suella Braverman, and it was billed as a resignation because she had leaked an email she'd sent an email to an aide, and it was on ministerial business, and she shouldn't have been using her personal account to send this email. But behind the scenes, what it sounded like was that there was a big policy difference between Liz Truss / Jeremy Hunt and Suella Braverman on immigration. And Jeremy Hunt, who's considered to be on the sort of left wing of the party, was not too concerned about bringing net migration down. Suella Braverman felt very, very differently. And this sort of fission led to Suella having to go, again writing a very, very biting resignation letter. And after that, she had lost her Chancellor and her Home Secretary. She appointed Grant Shapps to replace Suella Braverman. Grant Shapps is very much on the Jeremy Hunt wing of the party. It did sort of feel as though she was Prime Minister in name only.
And the next day, of course, a resignation. And this was the most remarkable time. We'd rattled through a number of Prime Ministers very quickly, but incredibly quickly then, we got another one.
Well, 44 days Liz Truss lasted from becoming Prime Minister to announcing her resignation. I think there was a widespread understanding in the Conservative Party that another 8-week leadership contest, particularly at a time of such multiple crises, wasn't acceptable or desirable. They set the bar incredibly high for the replacement of Liz Truss, essentially trying to make sure that there would only be one candidate, that candidate being Rishi Sunak.
It is a wild time, though, because Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister and he now has a fairly ungovernable party beneath him.
Yes, it felt very much as though the support behind Rishi Sunak was miles wide and inches deep. The Conservative Party, when faced with the real prospect of electoral oblivion, did focus their minds and unite behind Rishi Sunak. And you saw all sorts of people, including Kemi Badenoch, for example, who's very powerful, Michael Gove, throwing their support in behind Rishi Sunak.
And Suella Braverman, of course.
And Suella Braverman herself, which did feel at the time, and he kept Jeremy Hunt in place, which added a sort of sense of stability. And it felt as though it was going to be sort of politics returning to normal. We have seen in the last bit of the year politics roughly return to normal, but it feels as though there are quite a lot of tensions under the surface. There are a lot of unhappy Conservatives who didn't want Rishi Sunak over the summer. They know that their constituents didn't particularly want Rishi Sunak, and those problems are beginning to raise their ugly little heads again.
A very difficult Christmas and perhaps not the happiest of New Years for the Prime Minister, but what a 12 months it's been.
Well, that was 2022, the year in politics. The most eventful year in Westminster since the one before it. Well, we'll bring you all of the action on what on earth 2023 might hold right here on GB News. But for now, have a very happy New Year.
Looking ahead to tomorrow's weather, and the UK will see a cold and frosty start for many, but turning wetter in the west. Here are the details. A cold and icy start to Tuesday morning across northern Scotland, with sleet and snow showers, turning cloudy as rain and hill snow arrives from the south, turning windy too. A wet morning across Northern Ireland with brisk winds developing. The rain could be heavy at times, leading to some tricky travelling conditions. Cloud amounts increasing through Tuesday morning across northern England, the wind picking up too, icy stretches around first thing as the cold air lingers. A cloudy and damp morning for Wales and the Liverpool Bay Area as rain moves in from the west, the rain turning heavy as the morning progresses, temperatures rising after a cold start. A patchy frost across the Midlands Tuesday morning, but temperatures quickly rising as clouds spread in from the west. The risk of rain arriving as the morning progresses, with the winds increasing too. A cold and frosty start for many across East Anglia tomorrow morning, with some morning sunshine. Cloud amounts increasing from the west as the morning moves on, with rain arriving later. A chilly start to the day across southern England, with the best of any morning sunshine in the east. Clouds increasing as the morning progresses, turning windy too, with rain later. Wet and windy weather will continue eastwards through the day, with snow falling over Scotland. Temperatures on the mild side for many.
I'm Mark Dolan. Join me at 11 on GB News for Headliners, in which I'll be joined by two of the UK's top comedians discussing tomorrow's papers. If it's an important story, we'll cover it, but we'll have some fun along the way. Headliners, the late night paper review that won't send you to sleep like the others will. 7 nights a week at 11 p.m. on GB News.